What is it that we in the West are really facing here? I ask the question because the answer is not obvious. It hasn't been to me anyway. Over the past 10 years or so, perhaps a little longer, I've had the feeling that our societies in the West, and particularly from my point of view, my own society, that of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, to give it its official and rather overlong proper name, its pronoun if you will, were slowly disintegrating. I say slowly, but the pace of that disintegration has seemed to accelerate with every passing year. Since March 2020, that sense of disintegration has become a sprint, truly a race to the bottom. Again, from my point of view, I felt that the spirit of freedom to be in serious decline in Britain, which coincided, and was not a coincidence, with the sinister rise of the surveillance state. First we had CCTV, then automatic number plate recognition, then smartphones, then facial recognition, then 5G and the so-called Internet of Things, then track and trace, now a path towards a cashless society, and digital IDs, all leading to the conclusion of a social credit system, indistinguishable from that operating in capitalist communist China. But as bad as that is, and will continue to be up until March 2020, it was a relatively slow burn thing. It was gradual. Each new step was terrifying, at least to me, but no step taken was too sudden nor too drastic to actually scare the horses, or the British population in this case. British people continued to walk around as if they were as free as they really were in 1990, say, just after the Berlin Wall came down. But even though sovereign citizens of the UK were increasingly monitored by the surveillance professionals at the General Communication Headquarters, or GCHQ, Brits still felt free and continued to behave as if they were. For the secret peeping Tom, such as GCHQ are, this was bonanza time, in much the same way as the blissfully unaware young woman who undresses in the mistaken belief that she remains unobserved by the unseen pervert outside her window. This is the time of the juiciest results. Edward Snowden revealed that GCHQ, much like the NSA in the US, have been getting a raging hard-on, staring at the full frontal nudity of the British public's private life for the past 30 years. Anonymity died first, followed by privacy. Liberty will be next. But like I say, this has been a gradual, or far from slow process. But every so often, things happen that mark a sudden shift. Well, it's sudden to us. That thing, although it broke overnight, had been affecting those involved for years, or even decades. The scandal of the grooming gangs, or to describe them less euphemistically, the mass gang raping of working and middle class underage girls, overwhelmingly by organised gangs of Pakistani men, was perhaps the first, most shocking and most undeniable signal that something was very, very, very wrong with our society. After that, we could never again tell ourselves that Britain was a good society. Sure, we could still say that there was goodness in it, but due to the failure of all those institutions that were expressly and purposely designed to prevent anything like this ever happening again, afterwards all we could ever say was that goodness existed, but not only was it not guaranteed, but that in some places it wasn't even the norm. Goodness had been replaced with evil, and neither the police, the social services, nor the local politicians, who all knew that it was going on, did anything at all to stop it. So the police didn't police, the social services didn't protect the most vulnerable in our society, and the politicians cared not a jot for those whose interests they were entrusted with. Our judiciary fails to protect the public from the most dangerous of individual criminals. Only last month, a habitual and persistent sex offender is on the run because he escaped from an open prison. I think I've driven past the prison in question, and escaping looks as if it entails no more than walking through the unlocked, not to say unclosed, front gate. Meanwhile, a journalist whose only crime was to tell the world the truth about what the United States had been doing militarily remains in Belmarsh Prison in East London, which is supposed to house Britain's most dangerous terrorists. The border force fails to enforce the borders, allowing thousands upon thousands of people, but mostly young men of fighting age, to enter the country unhindered, with no demands made upon them, and about which we know nothing, not even their vaccination status. And that is in addition to the hundreds of thousands of legal immigrants that also come here every year, immigrants that the British people were never consulted about. The supposedly incorrupt civil service fails to service the British civilization. Instead of speaking truth to power on behalf of the British people, it instead ignores them and blatantly follows its own agenda. And even when it doesn't ignore them, it lectures and infantilizes them by referring to them as the children. Every institution we have is either incapable, or what is more likely, it is unwilling to fulfill even its most basic tasks. This cannot be an accident. The failing of one or two institutions could possibly be explained away by incompetence, but even that is a stretch for an entire institution to fail so completely. But all of them? How is that even possible? If it was just incompetence, it stands to reason that some institutions will, perhaps not succeed, but at least stay functional, even just by the law of averages. These failures must be failures by design. They must be. I can see no other rational explanation. And that inevitably leads us to ask the obvious question, why? Why has there been a relentless determination to undermine everything that was good about our society? Because of the depth to which our country has sunk, there is a tendency to be equally relentlessly cynical about the motives of the actors involved. This is understandable. Having glimpsed the full horror of how failed everything that matters is, perhaps the only way of coping with it psychologically is to preempt our disappointment, get our cynicism in early, and dial our expectations of decency down to zero, so that we are less shocked when the inevitable shameful behaviour, not to mention our foolish naivety, is revealed. But maybe that's a mistake. Maybe that's just a self-fulfilling prophecy. Maybe it's also a little cowardly, because it takes courage to be hopeful. It takes courage to risk disappointment. It takes courage to risk being revealed as a fool. But this why remains puzzling. Take the BBC. Like I say, it's easy to be cynical about Britain's national broadcaster, and with good reason. And this cynicism is not new, since the Beeb have been churning out anti-British shite for decades. The first time I personally noticed it was during the Falklands conflict, when I was a teenager, all the way back in 1982. But thereafter there has been a steady drip, drip, drip of treacherous backbiting ever since, reaching a crescendo in the years after the Brexit referendum, when its demonstrable anti-British stance was revealed in all its ugly glory. But this is not what is puzzling, or at least no more puzzling than the previous decades. The BBC is anti-British, but it would cloak its obviously treasonous positions in scepticism of all things that were not exclusively British, but were nevertheless pillars of British society. The royal family, the church, white people generally, aspirational consumerism of the plebs. How dare they want foreign holidays? But more than anything, that thing that had produced the prosperity that all other things were dependent upon. Capitalism. Whenever any company, and particularly British ones, were successful, the oh-so-serious and impartial BBC journalists would subject said company and its executives to withering and sustained scrutiny in the guise of the public interest, with the implication that the firm was in some way either exploiting its workers, its customers, or even the taxpayer. Now, some of this was warranted. There definitely were some robber barons that needed taking down a peg or two, particularly during the early days of Thatcherism, and again after the financial crash of 2008. The unacceptable face of capitalism did need challenging, even if it was for the wrong reasons. And the wrong reason, which the BBC and other media organs did pursue, was to undermine the prosperity of the United Kingdom. That has been their main aim, as far as I can tell, for many, many years. Attack capitalism, which is the lifeblood of any prosperous society, and you attack the nation, or at least the capitalist nation at any rate. Once capitalist Britain has been replaced with socialist Britain, I'm assuming that the sniping will cease. I guess we'll see, won't we? But in previous times, one of the BBC's and the rest of the media's biggest targets would have been the pharmaceutical companies. After all, weren't they amongst the very worst of the capitalist canon? Making money off of suffering, having developed drugs that could cure people, and then having the effrontery to actually charge for the medicines. What bastards, eh? So when framing such arguments, and the documentary films to go along with them, the media were, in the court of public opinion, pushing at an open door. The drug companies were fair game, and one of them, GlaxoSmithKline, was actually Britain's biggest company. Taking it down was a blow against capitalism, and by extension, capitalist Britain. But along comes COVID, a worldwide plague, and the race to develop a worldwide vaccine is on. And the media somehow forget all about what an existential menace to society the drugs companies are, and they are instead greeted as if they were the cavalry, riding to the rescue. How did that happen? My feeling is that happened because the government, who are also anti-British, remember, but we'll come back to that, had a word with the media, along with a £300 million cheque for advertising, to the effect that it could well be that the vaccines were the most likely path to creating a centrally planned, authoritarian state that would most resemble the socialist utopia that they all imagined they were going to create when they were at university. And they all had been to university. Introduce a threat, or at least massively over-exaggerate an existing threat, then provide a solution after softening up the population with a relentless propaganda campaign. Instill the mantra that saving lives is all that matters, and that no sacrifice is too great, not even the elimination of our free society, in order to achieve that aim. The results of this, after this assault, is a society that has surrendered all of its individual liberties, all of its individual compassion, all of its individual self-respect, and all of its individual self-reliance. All that remains is an overmighty government, staffed by the university class, who can then direct and dictate to the ignorant commoners who are too stupid to know what's in their best interests. Truly a socialist utopia. So who's behind this? It's far from clear, but I don't think we can go far wrong if we follow two lines of inquiry. In the first instance, it's follow the money, and in the second, cui bono. Often these lines of inquiry will converge. Now, being a plumber and not an investigative journalist with the resources of a media company, to pay my wages whilst I investigate, I can't say for sure. I can only guess. I can only come up with circumstantial evidence, even if I can do that. But someone has to try, or at least to ask questions, which is something that has been severely lacking these past 2 years. As Thomas Sheridan of YouTube fame puts it so succinctly, if we had any journalists, we wouldn't have any conspiracy theories. Take the case of Barry Gardiner. Gardiner is a Labour MP representing the seat of Brent North, and was recently accused of receiving over £500,000 from a woman called Christine Lee. Now, it is only an accusation, so we don't know if it's true just yet. But Lee was recently outed as an operative of the Chinese Communist Party by MI5, something that MI5 very rarely does. And in MI5 speak, operative just means spy. Gardiner himself has predictably denied any wrongdoing, saying that the money was for staffing costs of his office. But there are two obvious questions that arise from this. Firstly, why would the staffing costs of the office of a British Member of Parliament be met by anyone other than the MP himself, let alone by a foreign national from a hostile power? And secondly, considering this story broke in mid-January, why has there been no coverage since? I remember clicking on an image at the time, supposedly of his house, which looked like the country seat of some aristocrat, rather than of somebody who earns the relatively modest sum of £81,000 a year. plus expenses. Like I say, I don't know if he really does live in a vast country manor, or if he is actually in the pay of the CCP, but the fact that this story has sunk without a trace since then seems rather suspicious in itself. Once again, there has been a total lack of curiosity from the British media, but following the money here has quite easily led to the Chinese regime. And although Gardner appears to have benefited from the 500 grand, inappropriate or not, having a British MP in your pocket is probably considered a bargain, considering how wealthy China now is. Cui bono? China. But that's just the one we know about. How many more might there be? How many MPs might there be on the payroll of the CCP? How many US senators and congressmen? How many more might there be that are much more sophisticated than Gardner in hiding their cash? Gardner is relatively small fry, being a Labour MP in a long period of Conservative governance. But what would be the effect of a Chinese spy in the Department of Energy, perhaps promoting the idea of China being involved in Britain's nuclear energy supply, such as the recently closed down involvement of Huawei after the intervention of the Americans? If Huawei had built our nuclear power stations, and perhaps with ultimate control over them, what then? Cui bono? China. What might be the effect of Chinese influence in our Ministry of Defence by undermining the fighting spirit of our armed services in promoting the idea of recruiting snowflakes but rejecting patriots as far right or suspect, whilst their recruitment focuses on nationalism and manliness? Who could possibly gain from that? Cui bono? China. What might be the effect of promoting a radical trans ideology into British society through established and previously well-respected gay rights protest groups like Stonewall? What would be the effect of that? Might such a thing perhaps weaken family-based British and Western society? And if it did, cui bono? China. Who might possibly gain from releasing a pathogenic virus into all the rich Western nations, encouraging an hysterical and damaging overreaction of lockdowns, censorship and forced vaccinations that crashed their economies, indebted them to a scale never seen before, even in wartime, and destroyed public trust in their institutions and encouraged societal breakdown, leaving them demoralised, broke and ripe for accepting a social credit system much like China's? Cui bono? China. And who finally might just possibly benefit from a war between a feeble and fading nuclear power and a rapidly disintegrating top dog that seems to have lost all confidence in itself to do anything, let alone stand up for the values it was founded on? Who might conceivably gain from that? As COVID, this supposedly existential threat that has utterly obsessed the entire Western world for the best part of 2 years, not so much recedes, but magically vanishes, not only from our consciousness, but also, it appears, from our collective memory. Might it be a good idea to perhaps at least entertain the idea that maybe, just maybe, we're being played? Who benefits? I wonder.